I'm Natalie, 26, and the moment I saw that ring on his hand, my entire world shifted. The same emerald green stone, the same unique setting that had haunted my dreams for 18 years. My new billionaire boss was wearing my father's ring. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely blindsided by a family secret. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me take you back to where this all started. I was 8 years old when my father disappeared from my life without explanation. No goodbye, no forwarding address, no phone calls. One day he was there making me pancakes and teaching me to tie my shoes. The next day, his side of the closet was empty. My mother never talked about it. When I asked where Daddy went, she'd get that distant look and change the subject. Some people aren't meant to stay, was all she'd say, like he was some kind of seasonal visitor instead of my father. But I remembered everything about him, the way he smelled like coffee and aftershave, how he'd sing off-key in the shower, the stories he'd make up about brave princesses who saved themselves, and that ring, that distinctive emerald ring he wore on his right hand. I used to trace the stone with my finger while he read to me. This belonged to my father, he told me once. And his father before him. It's very special. Special enough to abandon your daughter, apparently. After he left, my mother became a different person, quieter, sadder. She worked 2 jobs trying to keep our small apartment, but it was never enough. I learned early not to ask for things, not to complain when dinner was cereal again, not to mention the kids at school who had fathers at their soccer games. When I was 12, my mother got sick. Cancer, though she tried to hide it from me for months. I'd find her throwing up in the bathroom and she'd claim it was just a stomach bug. But kids know. Kids always know when their world is about to fall apart again. She fought for 2 years. 2 years of hospitals and treatments we couldn't afford, of her getting thinner while I got older faster than I should have. 2 years of me taking care of her instead of her taking care of me. And through all of it, she never mentioned him. Not once. Even when she was dying. Even when I begged her to tell me who he really was and why he'd left us, she took those secrets to her grave. I was 14 when I became an orphan, officially. That's when the real adventure began. If you can call bouncing between foster homes and group facilities an adventure. Some families were kind. Others? Well, let's just say I learned early how to make myself invisible when adults were angry. But I survived. I more than survived. I fought my way through high school, worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for community college, and somehow managed to get my business degree. By the time I was 26, I'd clawed my way into a respectable life. Nothing fancy, but mine. That ring, though, that emerald ring lived in my memory like a splinter I couldn't dig out. Sometimes I'd dream about it, about him coming back to explain everything. But dreams don't pay rent, and I'd learned long ago that fairy tale endings were for other people. Or so I thought, until the day I walked into that boardroom and saw my past staring back at me from my new boss's hand. After my mother died, the state tried to find relatives. Anyone who might take in a 14-year-old girl with trust issues and a chip on her shoulder the size of Texas. They found exactly nobody. Your mother was very thorough about keeping her past private, the social worker explained, flipping through a file thinner than my hopes of a normal childhood. No emergency contacts, no family mentioned anywhere. Even dead, my mother was keeping her secrets. My first foster home was with the Johnsons, a middle-aged couple who meant well but already had 4 kids of their own. I was the charity case, the extra mouth they were paid to feed. They weren't cruel, just indifferent. I learned to do my own laundry, make my own meals, and handle my own problems. Natalie's very independent, Mrs. Johnson would tell her friends. Like independence was something I'd chosen instead of something that had been forced on me by circumstances. Independent. Right. That's what adults call it when a kid raises herself. I lasted 6 months there before aging out to a group home, not because they kicked me out, but because I asked to leave. Living with people who saw you as an obligation rather than a person gets old fast. The group home was actually better. At least there, everyone was in the same boat. We were all throwaway kids, all trying to figure out how to become functional adults without any roadmap. The staff were overworked but genuinely cared, and my roommate Sarah became the sister I'd never had. You ever wonder if your parents think about you? She asked one night as we lay in our narrow beds, staring at the ceiling. Every day, I admitted, but wondering doesn't change anything. Sarah's parents were drug addicts who'd lost custody when she was 9. At least she knew why they were gone. My father had just evaporated, like he'd never existed at all, except for that ring burned into my memory and the way I still looked for his face in crowds sometimes. High school was survival mode. I wasn't the smartest or prettiest or most popular, but I was determined. While other kids were worried about prom dates and college applications, I was working at a diner after school and weekends, saving every penny for whatever came next. College wasn't even on my radar until my English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, sat me down senior year. "You're too smart to waste your potential," she said bluntly. "Community college, financial aid, work-study programs. There's a path here if you want it." Want it? I'd wanted a lot of things over the years. A father who stayed, a mother who lived, a family that gave a damn. But wanting and getting were two different things in my experience. Still, I applied. Got accepted. Got enough financial aid to make it work if I lived on ramen and optimism. The next 4 years were a blur of classes, part-time jobs, and very little sleep. I studied business because it seemed practical, stable. The kind of degree that led to steady paychecks and health insurance. I graduated with honors and no one to call with the good news. By then, I'd learned to celebrate my victories alone. Learned to be my own cheerleader, my own support system, my own family. It wasn't exactly healthy, but it worked. I was functional, employed, and completely self-sufficient. The day I got hired at Morrison Industries, I treated myself to dinner at an actual restaurant instead of my usual takeout. Sitting there alone with my celebration meal, I thought about how proud my mother would have been, how maybe even my father would have been impressed by the woman I'd become, despite his abandonment. I had no idea that within a week, I'd be sitting across from someone who could answer every question about him I'd ever had. Life's funny that way. Just when you think you've made peace with the past, it shows up wearing a $1,000 suit and your father's ring. Morrison Industries occupied 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that screamed serious money to anyone within a 5-mile radius. I'd researched the company obsessively before my interview, memorizing revenue figures and business holdings like I was preparing for finals. The old man, Robert Morrison, had built an empire from nothing. Real estate, tech investments, manufacturing. If it made money, Morrison Industries had a piece of it. He died 6 months earlier, leaving everything to his son Marcus, who had a reputation for being as brilliant as he was ruthless. I was hired as a junior analyst, which was a fancy way of saying I'd be crunching numbers and preparing reports no one important would ever read. But it was a foot in the door at a company that could change my life, and I'd learned to appreciate every opportunity that came my way. My first week was orientation and paperwork, getting familiar with the office layout and figuring out who was actually in charge versus who just thought they were. The administrative assistant, Janet, took pity on me and explained the unwritten rules. "Mr. Morrison, the younger one, doesn't like small talk," she warned me. "Get to the point, know your facts, and never ever waste his time. He's got his father's head for business, but none of his patience for pleasantries." I'd catch glimpses of him sometimes, striding through the halls with that particular energy that comes with absolute authority. Tall, dark hair, expensive suits that probably cost more than I made in a month. He had the kind of presence that made conversations stop when he entered a room. But I was too low on the corporate food chain to worry about impressing the CEO. My boss was Linda Harrison, Director of Financial Analysis, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd worked her way up from the typing pool back when such things existed. "You remind me of myself at your age," she told me during my first week. "Hungry, determined, that's good. You'll need both qualities to survive here." The work was exactly what I'd expected. Long hours, complex spreadsheets, detailed reports that tracked every penny coming in and going out. I was good at it, maybe because I'd spent my whole life keeping careful track of limited resources. When you've lived on food stamps and government assistance, you develop a healthy respect for budgets. 3 weeks in, Linda called me into her office. "The quarterly board meeting is next Friday," she announced. "I need someone to present the third quarter analysis. You interested?" My heart jumped. Board meetings meant FaceTime with the executives, including Marcus Morrison. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been hoping for. "Absolutely," I said, trying not to sound as eager as I felt. I spent the entire week preparing, rehearsing my presentation until I could recite it backwards. I researched every board member, studied their backgrounds and interests, prepared for every possible question they might throw at me. The morning of the meeting, I put on my best suit, a navy blue number I'd bought at a discount store but had tailored to fit perfectly. Professional but not flashy, competent but not threatening. The carefully calibrated uniform of a woman trying to be taken seriously in a man's world. I arrived at the boardroom 15 minutes early, laptop bag clutched in my sweaty palms like a shield. The room was impressive, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a massive mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars, leather chairs that whispered important decisions happen here. Board members filed in gradually, chatting among themselves while I set up my presentation. I recognized them from their photos. Mostly older men in expensive suits, plus 2 women who had the particular polish that comes with decades of corporate success. And then Marcus Morrison walked in. That's when everything changed. The moment he entered the boardroom, the energy shifted. Conversations paused, postures straightened, and suddenly everyone was just a little bit more alert. Marcus Morrison commanded attention without trying, the kind of natural authority you can't fake or buy. He was younger than I'd expected, early 30s maybe, with the kind of sharp features that suggested intelligence rather than conventional handsomeness. Dark hair, darker eyes, and a presence that made the spacious boardroom feel smaller somehow. "Good morning," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table. His voice was deep, cultured, with just enough warmth to remind you he was human underneath all that corporate armor. And then I saw it. As he reached for his coffee cup, the light caught something on his right hand that made my blood freeze in my veins. The ring, same emerald stone, same antique gold setting, same unique design that had been burned into my memory since childhood. The ring my father had worn every single day, the one he'd told me belonged to his father and grandfather before him. My presentation materials scattered as my hands started shaking. 26 years old, and I was falling apart in the most important meeting of my career because of a piece of jewelry. "Ms. Harper?" Linda's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you ready to begin?" I cleared my throat, forced my hands steady, and clicked to the first slide of my presentation. Somehow, muscle memory and years of preparation carried me through the next 30 minutes. I heard my own voice explaining market trends and profit margins, watched myself point to graphs and charts, answered questions with statistics I'd memorized days earlier. But the entire time, my eyes kept drifting back to that ring. It couldn't be the same one. Couldn't be. The world wasn't that small. Coincidences like that didn't happen to people like me. There had to be thousands of emerald rings in the world, hundreds with similar settings. My mind was playing tricks on me, seeing what it wanted to see because I'd been thinking about my father lately. Except I knew it was the same ring. I knew it the way you know your own reflection, with absolute certainty that bypassed logic and reason. "Excellent work, Ms. Harper," Marcus said when I finished, and I realized the meeting was over without remembering the last 10 minutes. "Your analysis was thorough and well presented. Thank you, Mr. Morrison," I managed, gathering my things with hands that still trembled slightly. As board members filed out, chatting about lunch plans and afternoon meetings, I lingered by the windows, pretending to pack my laptop while I tried to process what I'd just seen. "Ms. Harper?" I turned to find Marcus Morrison standing behind me, close enough that I caught a hint of expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him. "I wanted to tell you personally how impressed I was with your presentation," he said. "Linda mentioned you've only been with us a few weeks." "Yes, sir. 3 weeks today." "Well, you've clearly done your homework. I look forward to seeing more of your work." He started to turn away, then paused. "Are you all right? You seemed a bit distracted during the meeting." This was my chance. The perfect opening to ask about the ring, to solve the mystery that had been eating at me for 18 years. Instead, I heard myself say, "Fine, just a little nervous. First board meeting and all." He smiled, and for a moment he looked less like a corporate titan and more like someone I might have been friends with in another life. "You did well. The nerves will pass." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the city skyline and the knowledge that the one concrete connection to my father was sitting in his office, making decisions that affected thousands of people's lives. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, mechanically entering data and running calculations while my mind spun in circles. How could Marcus Morrison have my father's ring? Had he bought it at an estate sale, inherited it from someone else, found it at an antique store? Or was there another explanation, one that would change everything I thought I knew about my past? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, seeing that emerald stone every time I closed my eyes. Have you ever experienced something so shocking that your brain just refuses to process it? Like when you're in an accident and everything moves in slow motion while you wait for reality to catch up? That was my entire week after the board meeting. I went through the motions of my job, analyzing reports, attending meetings, pretending to care about quarterly projections. While my mind obsessed over that ring, every logical explanation I came up with seemed more ridiculous than the last. Maybe my father had sold it before he disappeared. Maybe it was a family heirloom that had been passed down through multiple families. Maybe I was wrong about what I'd seen, my memory distorted by years of wishful thinking and unresolved questions. But deep down, I knew better. I'd spent enough sleepless nights as a child tracing that ring in my mind, remembering every detail of its unique setting. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or false hope. This was the real thing, which meant Marcus Morrison was somehow connected to my father. I started researching the Morrison family, staying up late into the night scrolling through newspaper articles and business profiles. Robert Morrison, the founder, had built his fortune from nothing, starting with a single construction project in the 1970s and expanding into real estate, then technology, then whatever seemed profitable at the time. But I couldn't find any connection to my father. No business partnerships, no shared associations, nothing that would explain how my father's ring ended up on his son's hand. "You've been distracted lately," Linda observed on Wednesday, catching me staring blankly at my computer screen for the third time that morning. "Just adjusting to the new workload," I lied, pulling up a spreadsheet I'd been pretending to work on. "The Morrison presentation really was impressive," she continued. "I've had 3 board members mention it to me. That kind of attention from the executive level this early in your career? Well, it's not something you want to waste." She was right, of course. I was being handed opportunities that most junior analysts would kill for, and I was squandering them because I couldn't stop thinking about a piece of jewelry. But how do you explain to your boss that you think your CEO might hold the key to your entire personal history? Thursday afternoon, I was in the employee break room getting coffee when Marcus Morrison walked in. Just him, no assistants or executives trailing behind, looking surprisingly normal as he fed quarters into the vending machine. "Ms. Harper," he said, noticing me hovering by the coffee pot with my cup frozen halfway to my lips. "Mr. Morrison," I managed. "Please, call me Marcus. The formality makes me feel ancient." He was being friendly, approachable, the perfect opportunity to ask the question that had been burning in my chest for 5 days. Instead, I said, "The vending machine's been eating people's money all week." He looked at the machine, which had just swallowed his quarters without dispensing the chips he'd selected, and laughed. "Figures. Some problems money can't solve, I guess." "Actually," I heard myself saying, "that's not entirely true." He raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to explain. "My father used to say that about problems. Some problems money can't solve, Natalie, but most of them it can help with." The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them, and I felt my face flush red. "Sorry, I don't know why I mentioned that." "Your father sounds like a practical man," Marcus said gently. "What does he do?" The opening was there, perfect and natural and everything I'd been hoping for. I'm not sure. He left when I was 8. Something flickered across Marcus's face. Sympathy, maybe, or recognition. "I'm sorry. That must have been difficult." "It was a long time ago," I said, setting down my coffee cup before my shaking hands could drop it. "Still," he said, and there was something in his voice that made me look up at him more carefully. "A father shouldn't abandon his children." The way he said it, with such conviction, made me wonder if he was speaking from experience. "Your father built quite an empire," I said carefully. "You must have learned a lot from him." I did. His expression grew thoughtful, though not all of his lessons were intentional. Before I could ask what he meant, his phone buzzed and the moment was broken. "Duty calls," he said with an apologetic smile. "Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, Natalie." It wasn't until he'd left that I realized he'd used my first name. 3 more days of sleepless nights and distracted work days passed before I finally worked up the courage to do something that could either answer all my questions or end my career before it really started. I was going to ask Marcus Morrison about his ring. The opportunity came Friday afternoon when Linda sent me upstairs to deliver quarterly reports to his office. "He's expecting these by 5, she said, handing me a thick folder. "Don't dawdle. He's got a dinner meeting at 6. The executive floor was like stepping into a different world. Thick carpets, original artwork, the kind of furniture that whispered old money and established power. Marcus's assistant directed me to his office, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the entire city. He was on the phone when I arrived, gesturing toward a chair while he finished his conversation. I sat down, folder clutched in my lap, trying not to listen to his discussion of merger negotiations and stock prices. "Sorry about that," he said, hanging up and turning his attention to me. "Hostile takeover attempt. Nothing personal, just business. But it still requires delicate handling." "The quarterly reports," I said, standing to hand him the folder. "Excellent. Linda's team continues to impress me." He set the folder aside without opening it, which told me the delivery was either routine or I was about to be fired for my increasingly obvious distraction. "Natalie," he said, leaning back in his chair, "can I ask you something?" My heart stopped. "Of course. You've seemed preoccupied lately. Is everything all right? If there's something affecting your work performance, I'd prefer to address it directly rather than let it become a problem." This was it, the moment of truth. I could lie, make up some excuse about personal problems or job stress, and continue living with questions that would probably drive me crazy for the rest of my life. Or I could take the biggest risk I'd ever taken and ask about the ring. "Actually," I heard myself say, my voice steadier than I felt, "there is something I wanted to ask you about." He nodded, waiting. "Your ring." The words came out in a rush before I lost my nerve. "The emerald one. It's very distinctive." His reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Every trace of color drained from his face. his hand instinctively moving to cover the ring, and his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me want to run from the room. Where? He started, then stopped, clearing his throat. What about my ring? I think I've seen it before, I said, my hands trembling so badly I had to clasp them together. When I was a child, my father had one exactly like it. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Marcus stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that looked almost like recognition. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What's your full name? Natalie Harper. Natalie Elizabeth Harper. He closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of whatever he was processing was too much to bear sitting upright. What was your father's name? He asked without opening his eyes. I don't know. My mother never told me. She said his name was David, but I don't know if that was real or what his last name was. He left when I was 8, and my mother died when I was 14 without ever explaining who he really was. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at me with something that might have been pity, or sorrow, or a combination of both. This ring, he said slowly, belonged to my father, and before him, my grandfather. It's been in the Morrison family for 3 generations. My world tilted sideways. That's impossible, I whispered. Natalie, he said gently, I think we need to have a very long conversation. What do you think happens when your entire life story gets rewritten in a single conversation? Drop your predictions in the comments below. Marcus closed his laptop and walked around his desk to sit in the chair beside mine, bringing us to the same level. The gesture felt significant somehow, like he was trying to minimize the power dynamic between us. When my father died 6 months ago, he began, his voice careful and measured. The lawyers found some unusual provisions in his will. I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell was allowing this conversation to happen. There was a trust fund, he continued, set up 26 years ago, with instructions that it be held until a specific person was located. A daughter he'd acknowledged legally but never brought home to our family. My breathing became shallow. A daughter, Natalie Elizabeth, born to Rebecca Harper in Portland, Oregon. The lawyers had been trying to locate her for months, but Rebecca Harper died 12 years ago, and her daughter had apparently aged out of the foster care system with no forwarding information. The room started spinning. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to anchor myself to something solid while my entire understanding of reality crumbled around me. That's me, I whispered. Rebecca was my mother. Marcus nodded slowly. When you mentioned your father leaving when you were 8, the timeline fits. My father made frequent business trips to Portland around that time. He always said it was about real estate opportunities, but he was visiting us, I finished. He was living 2 lives. It appears so. I found records of an apartment lease in Portland, rent payments that continued for years after you said he disappeared from your life. And this ring, he looked down at his hand. I inherited it when my father died, along with a note that said it should go to his son. I assumed that meant me. Maybe it did, I said numbly. Maybe I was never supposed to be part of that equation. No. His voice was firm. The legal documents are very clear. You were acknowledged as his daughter. Natalie, he set aside money for your education, your future. He just never told your family about me, I supplied. Never brought me home. Never chose me over his legitimate life. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications and realizations that were too big to process all at once. Does your mother know? I asked finally. About me, I mean. Marcus's expression darkened. She will now. But Natalie, you should understand. My mother has always known my father had affairs. She chose to ignore them for the sake of maintaining appearances and family stability. Finding out one of those affairs produced a child. That's going to be more difficult for her to accept. An affair. The word tasted bitter. That's what my mother was to him. What I was. A secret family he visited when it was convenient. You were his daughter, Marcus said firmly. Whatever the circumstances of your birth, whatever mistakes he made, you were his child. And according to these documents, he never forgot that. I laughed, a sound that came out more like a sob. He never forgot, but he never came back either. When my mother got sick, when she died, when I was bounced between foster homes, where was his responsibility then? I don't know, Marcus admitted. I can't defend choices I don't understand, but I can tell you this. You're here now. You're family, and that means something. Family. The word I'd spent 18 years longing to hear, and now that it was being offered, I wasn't sure I wanted it. What happens now? I asked. Now, Marcus said, reaching for his phone. I call our lawyers and arrange for you to access what's rightfully yours. And then, if you're willing, I'd like you to meet my mother. I thought about the little girl who used to dream about her father coming back with explanations and apologies, who used to imagine him searching for her, desperate to make amends for whatever had forced him to leave. That little girl would have been thrilled by this revelation. The woman I'd become was more cautious. She's not going to be happy about this, is she? Marcus's smile was rueful. Probably not, but happiness and acceptance are two different things. Give her time, Natalie. Give us all time to adjust to this new reality. New reality. As if my entire life up to this point had just been practice for whatever came next. The Morrison family mansion sat on 5 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city, the kind of place where you needed an appointment just to drive down the street. As Marcus's car wound up the circular driveway, I tried to calm my nerves by reminding myself that I had every right to be there. Didn't make it feel any less surreal. My mother can be intense, Marcus warned as we approached the front door. She's had 48 hours to process the news about you, which is either enough time to come to terms with it or enough time to build a really solid defense against it. Comforting, I muttered, smoothing my skirt for the 100th time. The house was everything I'd expected from old money. Marble foyers, crystal chandeliers, oil paintings that probably cost more than most people's homes. But it felt cold somehow, like a museum where people happened to live rather than a place where a family had grown up. Elizabeth Morrison was waiting for us in what Marcus called the sitting room, a formal space with uncomfortable-looking antique furniture and fresh flowers that had clearly been arranged by professionals. She was elegant in the way that only comes from generations of breeding and training, silver hair perfectly styled, wearing the kind of understated jewelry that whispered rather than shouted its value. She was also looking at me like I was something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Mother," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral, "I'd like you to meet Natalie Harper." "Ms. Harper," she acknowledged with a slight nod, not bothering to stand or offer her hand. "Please sit." I perched on the edge of a chair that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, suddenly very aware of how out of place I looked in this pristine environment. "I understand there are some legal matters to discuss," Elizabeth continued, her tone suggesting we were here to negotiate a business deal rather than acknowledge family relationships. "More than legal matters, Mother," Marcus said firmly. "Natalie is Dad's daughter." "So the documents suggest," she replied coolly. "Though I think we can all agree that biology doesn't automatically create family bonds." The dismissal stung, even though I'd been expecting something like it. This woman had just discovered her husband's secret child, after all. I couldn't expect her to welcome me with open arms. "I'm not here to disrupt your family," I said quietly. "I just wanted answers about my father." Elizabeth's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Your mother was Rebecca Harper?" "Yes, ma'am." "I knew about her," she said, and the admission hung in the air like a confession. "I knew Robert was seeing someone in Portland. I chose not to investigate the details because I didn't want to know how deep his deception went." "But you knew about me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I suspected. When the lawyers found the trust fund and the birth certificate, it confirmed what I'd always feared, that Robert's Portland visits weren't just about business." She stood and walked to the window, staring out at gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. "I need you to understand something, Ms. Harper. I built my life around maintaining this family's reputation and stability. Robert's indiscretions were manageable as long as they remained private, but a child changes everything. I'm 26 years old," I pointed out. "Not exactly a child anymore." "No," she agreed, turning back to face me. "You're an adult who has every legal right to claim her inheritance and her place in this family. The question is whether that's what you actually want." It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since walking out of Marcus's office 2 days earlier. "I don't know what I want," I admitted. "I've spent my whole life wondering who my father was and why he left. Now I know, but I'm not sure the truth is better than the mystery." "The truth rarely is," Elizabeth said, and for the first time her voice held something like sympathy. "But it's what we have to work with." She returned to her chair, studying me with the kind of careful assessment I imagined she applied to potential investments. "If you decide to pursue this relationship," she said finally, "I want you to understand that it won't be simple. There will be publicity, questions from business associates, social complications you haven't considered. Are you trying to talk me out of claiming my inheritance?" "I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're claiming," she corrected. "Money is the easy part, Ms. Harper. It's the everything else that gets complicated." She was right, of course. I'd been so focused on the father-shaped hole in my past that I hadn't really considered the future-shaped complications this revelation would create. "However," she continued, straightening in her chair, "Marcus is right about one thing. Whatever your father's failings as a husband, they don't diminish his responsibility as a parent. You are his daughter, and that means something in this family. It wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but it wasn't a rejection either. The law offices of Pemberton. Hayes and Associates occupied an entire floor of a downtown building that screamed, "Serious legal matters handled here." As Marcus and I sat in the conference room waiting for the lawyers to arrive with what they called the full documentation, I couldn't help but think about how surreal my life had become. 3 weeks ago, I was a junior analyst trying to make ends meet on an entry-level salary. Now I was about to find out exactly how much money my father had set aside for a daughter he'd never publicly acknowledged. "Nervous?" Marcus asked, noticing me fidgeting with my pen. "Terrified," I admitted. "This is all happening so fast. We can slow it down if you need more time to process everything." I shook my head. "No, I want answers. I've waited 18 years. I don't want to wait any longer." The conference room door opened and 3 lawyers filed in, carrying folders thick enough to choke a horse. James Pemberton, the senior partner, was exactly what you'd expect from someone who managed billionaire estates. Silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of handling other people's money. "Ms. Harper," he said, extending his hand. "I'm very pleased to finally meet you. We've been looking for you for quite some time." "So I've heard. I understand there are some documents I need to see." "Indeed. Before we begin, however, I want you to understand that your father was very specific about the conditions under which this information was to be revealed. He wanted to ensure that if you were ever located, you would understand both your rights and the complexity of your situation." He opened the first folder and spread papers across the polished table. Birth certificate, legal acknowledgement of paternity, trust fund documents, and a sealed letter with my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow knew belonged to my father. "The trust fund was established the year you were born," Pemberton explained. "Your father contributed to it regularly until his death, with instructions that it be held in perpetuity until you were located and could claim it." "How much?" I asked, then immediately felt crass for making money the first question. "The current value is approximately $2.8 million, he said matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing the weather. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd grown up on food stamps and secondhand clothes, worked 3 jobs to afford community college, lived in a studio apartment where the heat barely worked. And the entire time, there was nearly $3 million sitting in an account with my name on it. He also left specific instructions regarding Morrison Industries," Pemberton continued. "As his daughter, you're entitled to inherit a portion of his shares in the company, not a controlling interest, but enough to make you a significant shareholder and give you a seat on the board of directors if you choose to claim it." I looked at Marcus, whose expression was carefully neutral. "Did you know about this part?" "I suspected there might be company shares involved," he admitted, "but I didn't know the details until this morning." Pemberton slid another document across the table. "There's also the matter of the Portland property. Your father owned the apartment building where you and your mother lived. He continued making improvements and covering maintenance costs long after you'd left. According to these records, he never gave up hope that you might return there someday. The apartment building, the place where I'd spent the first 8 years of my life, where my mother had struggled to pay rent we apparently didn't even owe. He'd owned it the entire time. Why didn't he just tell us?" I whispered. "Why the secrecy, the lies, the abandonment? If he cared enough to set all this up, why didn't he stay?" Pemberton's expression softened. "Perhaps his letter will provide some answers." He handed me the sealed envelope, my name written across it in faded ink. My hands shook as I opened it, unfolding pages that had been waiting 26 years to be read. "My dear Natalie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've finally learned the truth about who you are. I hope you can forgive an old man's cowardice for not having the courage to tell you these things while I was alive. I loved your mother more than I had any right to, and I loved you from the moment you were born, but I was a married man with responsibilities to another family, and I convinced myself that keeping you secret was protecting everyone involved. I was wrong. I know that now. I left when you were 8 because Elizabeth discovered our relationship and threatened to destroy everything I'd built if I didn't end it immediately. I thought I was protecting your mother and you by disappearing, but I see now that I was protecting myself. The money, the company shares, the property, these are poor substitutes for the father you deserved. But they're yours by right, and I hope they can provide some security that my absence never could. You have a brother in Marcus. He's a good man, better than I was. If you choose to claim your place in this family, I hope you'll find in him the sibling you never knew you had. I'm sorry, Natalie, for the lies, the abandonment, the years of questions I left unanswered. You deserved better than a father who loved you from a distance. All my love and regrets. Robert Morrison, Dad." I read the letter twice before setting it down, my vision blurred by tears I hadn't realized I was crying. So there it was. The answer I'd been searching for my entire life. He'd left because his wife threatened him, and he'd chosen his legitimate family over his secret one. It wasn't the fairy tale reunion I'd dreamed about as a child, but at least it was the truth. Have you ever had your entire life change in the span of a single afternoon? That's exactly what happened when I signed those papers, officially claiming an inheritance I'd never known existed. $2.8 million. Company shares worth another several million. Real estate holdings. Investment portfolios that had been growing my father's gilt money for 18 years. I walked out of that law office as one of the wealthiest people under 30 in the city, and all I could think about was how none of it would bring back the childhood I'd lost. How are you processing all this? Marcus asked as we sat in his car outside the law building, neither of us quite ready to return to normal life yet. I keep thinking about my mother, I said honestly. How hard she worked, how many jobs she took to keep us afloat, and the entire time he was paying the rent without telling us. She died thinking we were charity cases. Maybe he thought he was protecting her pride. Or maybe he was protecting his own guilty conscience. The bitterness in my voice surprised me. I'm sorry, I know he was your father too. Don't apologize. You have every right to be angry. Marcus leaned back against the headrest, looking suddenly tired. I've been angry at him my entire life for different reasons. Finding out about you just adds another layer to it. What reasons? He was never really present, even when he was physically there. Always traveling, always working, always focused on building this empire instead of being a father. I spent my childhood trying to earn his attention and approval. I thought about that, about how differently we'd experienced the same man's failings. Marcus had grown up with every material advantage but felt emotionally neglected. I'd grown up with nothing but had treasured every moment of attention my father had given me during those first 8 years. At least you knew he existed, I pointed out. At least he didn't abandon you, Marcus countered. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us grappling with the complex emotions that came with inheriting someone else's unfinished business. What happens now? I asked finally. Now you decide what you want to do with all of this. The money, the company shares, the family connections. None of it comes with strings attached, Natalie. You can take the inheritance and walk away from all of us if that's what you prefer. The option was tempting. Take the money, quit my job, disappear to some tropical island where no one knew about my complicated family history. Start fresh with enough financial security to do whatever I wanted for the rest of my life. But something held me back. What would you do if I took the company shares? I asked. Welcome the help, honestly. Running Morrison Industries alone is overwhelming. Having a family member who actually understands business to share the responsibility with would be a relief, even though I'm illegitimate, even though accepting me might cause problems with your mother and your social circles, especially because of that, he said firmly. This family has too many secrets already. Maybe it's time we started being honest about who we really are. I looked at him, my half-brother, who'd inherited the same eyes as our father, and apparently the same stubborn streak that had built an empire. A week ago, he'd been my intimidating CEO. Now he was the only family I had left. I don't know anything about running a company, I warned him. You know about financial analysis, you understand business strategy, and you've got more real-world experience than most people who inherit positions like this. The rest we can figure out together. Together, I tested the word, trying to imagine what that might look like. Partners, he clarified. Siblings, whatever you're comfortable calling it. I thought about the little girl who used to dream about having a big brother to protect her from the scary parts of foster care, who used to imagine family dinners and holiday traditions and people who shared her history. Okay, I said finally. Let's try the family, but I'm keeping my apartment and my independence. This doesn't mean you get to take care of me or make decisions for me. Marcus smiled, and for the first time since this whole revelation began, it felt genuine rather than careful. I wouldn't dream of it. You've been taking care of yourself just fine for 26 years. And if your mother decides she can't handle having me around, then that's her choice to make. But you're not going anywhere, Natalie. You've got as much right to be part of this family as anyone else. As we drove back toward downtown, I caught my reflection in the side mirror. Same face, same hair, same girl who'd walked into that law office 3 hours earlier. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone in the world. 3 months after the inheritance papers were signed, I was still adjusting to the surreal reality of having more money than I knew what to do with, and a family that was slowly learning how to include me in their orbit. The transition wasn't smooth. Nothing about this situation was simple enough for smooth, but it was happening. Elizabeth Morrison and I had reached what could generously be called a détente. She was never going to see me as anything other than evidence of her husband's betrayal, but she'd stopped treating me like an intruder at family dinners. Progress. Of a sort. You handle yourself well in board meetings, she'd told me after my third month attending Morrison Industries' monthly sessions. Better than some people who've been in business for decades. Coming from her, it felt like a Nobel Prize. Marcus and I were finding our rhythm as business partners, though the sibling part was still a work in progress. We'd inherited the same analytical mind and the same stubborn streak, which made us effective collaborators and occasional opponents in equal measure. You realize you can't just implement every reform idea you have in the first 6 months, he'd said during our latest disagreement about employee benefits packages. And you realize that having money doesn't mean we should ignore the people who help us make it, I'd shot back. But we were learning to navigate these conflicts without the emotional landmines that came with most family businesses. Maybe because we'd both grown up feeling like outsiders in different ways, we understood the value of creating something more inclusive than what we'd inherited. The Portland property had been the biggest surprise. Walking through the apartment building where I'd spent my childhood, now as its owner rather than a tenant, felt like stepping into a parallel universe. The current tenants were mostly young families and elderly residents who'd been there for years, all paying below market rent because my father had apparently never raised it significantly. It's like he was trying to take care of the community you'd been part of, Marcus had observed when we toured the building together. His way of staying connected to that part of his life. I'd decided to keep it as affordable housing, establishing a foundation to maintain it properly while keeping rents reasonable for people who needed safe, decent places to live. It felt like the right way to honor both my mother's memory and my father's better instincts. The money itself was still an adjustment. I'd opened investment accounts and hired financial advisors, but I was living on a fraction of what I could afford while I figured out what kind of life I actually wanted to build. Growing up poor had taught me the difference between wants and needs, and suddenly having unlimited wants available was overwhelming. But the family part, that was the real revelation. Sunday dinners at the Morrison house had become routine. Elizabeth would oversee formal meals where we discussed business, current events, and anything except the complicated emotions that had brought us together. It wasn't warm exactly, but it was consistent, predictable, something I could count on. Marcus and I had started meeting for coffee every Tuesday morning, a ritual that had begun as business planning and evolved into something that felt almost like normal sibling relationships. We'd argue about company policy, share stories about our different childhoods, and slowly fill in the gaps that 18 years of separation had created. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he'd brought you home when you were 8? He asked during one of these conversations. "Every day," I admitted. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed lost?" Also every day. It wasn't the family reunion I'd dreamed about as a child. There were too many complicated emotions and unresolved hurts for fairy tale endings, but it was real, and it was mine. And I was learning to appreciate the difference between perfect and genuine. The ring had become a symbol of that complexity. Marcus had offered to give it back to me since it had originally belonged to our father, but I'd declined. "He gave it to you," I'd said. "That means something too." Instead, we'd had matching rings made. Different stones, same setting. His remained emerald, mine was sapphire. A way of honoring the connection while acknowledging that our relationships with our father had been fundamentally different. Some evenings, usually when I was alone in my apartment, I'd look at that ring and think about all the questions that would never be answered. Whether my father had really loved my mother, or if she'd just been a convenient escape from his real life. Whether he'd ever planned to tell Elizabeth about me, or if he'd intended to take the secret to his grave. Whether he'd ever actually missed me after he left. But I was learning to live with unanswered questions. The little girl who'd needed fairy tale explanations had grown into a woman who could handle complicated truths. And the truth was this: I finally belonged somewhere. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more incredible true stories of families, secrets, and second chances. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that I'd be sitting in the CEO office of Morrison Industries, helping my half-brother plan the expansion of our family's business empire, I would have laughed them out of the room. 6 months ago, I was a junior analyst living paycheck to paycheck, with no family and no prospects beyond working my way slowly up some corporate ladder. Today, I'm reviewing architectural plans for a new affordable housing development that will bear my mother's name, while wearing a sapphire ring that matches my brother's emerald one, and fielding text messages from my stepmother about whether I prefer the salmon or the chicken for next Sunday's dinner. Life's funny that way. Just when you think you've accepted that some questions will never have answers, the universe decides to hand you a story ending you never saw coming. The emerald ring, the one that started all of this, sits in a place of honor on Marcus's desk, catching the afternoon light from the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the city where I grew up invisible and alone. Sometimes I catch him turning it on his finger the same way I remember our father doing, and I wonder if he's thinking about the choices that led us all to this point. Elizabeth Morrison will never be the warm, nurturing stepmother that Hallmark movies promise. But she's become something more valuable. A woman who respects my intelligence and includes me in family decisions, even when those decisions are difficult. She's teaching me about the responsibilities that come with wealth and influence. Lessons my father never had the chance to share. Money doesn't make you a better person, she told me last week as we reviewed funding proposals for the Morrison Foundation, but it does give you the power to do better things. Use that power wisely. The foundation was my idea, a way to channel some of the fortune I'd inherited into programs that helped kids aging out of foster care. Kids like I'd been, who needed someone to believe in their potential even when they couldn't see it themselves. Marcus had supported the idea immediately. Dad left us more than money, he'd said. He left us the obligation to do something meaningful with it. The business side of my new life came surprisingly naturally. Turns out that growing up poor teaches you valuable lessons about resource management and strategic thinking that business schools try to replicate in case studies. When you've had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, corporate budget decisions feel almost simple by comparison. I kept my apartment downtown, despite Marcus's suggestions that I move to something more befitting my new net worth. The small studio with its questionable heating and non-existent view reminds me where I came from, keeps me grounded in a way that marble foyers and private elevators couldn't. Besides, I like having a space that's completely mine, decorated with furniture I chose and books I actually read, rather than the kind of showcase living that comes with inherited mansions. Some evenings, I sit by my single window and think about the father I found and lost in the same revelation, about the man who loved me enough to leave me money but not enough to stay and raise me, about the choices that ripple through generations, creating consequences no one could have predicted. I think about my mother too, and wonder what she would make of all this. Whether she'd be proud of the woman I became, or concerned about the wealth I've inherited. Whether she'd understand my decision to forgive a man who abandoned us both, in his own complicated way. The truth is, I may never fully understand why my father made the choices he did, why he kept me secret, why he left when his wife discovered us, why he never tried to reconcile after my mother died. But I've learned to live with questions that don't have perfect answers. What I do understand is this. Belonging doesn't always look like the fairy tales promise. Sometimes it's messy and complicated and full of people who love you imperfectly. Sometimes it's built on shared loss rather than shared joy. But it's still belonging. The little girl who used to dream about her father coming back to rescue her from foster care could never have imagined this ending. Not because it's happier than she hoped, but because it's more complex than she could have comprehended. I didn't get the father I'd dreamed of, but I got something else. A brother who values my opinions, a stepmother who challenges my thinking, and the resources to make sure other kids don't grow up feeling as alone as I did. I got a family that chose to include me even when it would have been easier not to, and in the end, that turned out to be worth more than all the emerald rings and trust funds in the world. The ring may have brought me home, but it was the people who decided to make room for me who made it worth staying. Sometimes the best endings aren't about getting what you always wanted. Sometimes they're about discovering what you actually needed was something else entirely. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get both.